Oh, I get to read one comment.
Oh yeah, the
comments.
last time
All right.
they had.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel Sputman, and I am the co-founder of Global Futurists Initiative, a United Nations Association of the United States Global Goals Ambassador lead and an IYC delegate. Thank you, Ali, for inviting me and for allowing me to be able to introduce my network and the youth that are going to, and intergenerational allies that are going to speak for this afternoon's session. So to begin is the session called Perspectives from Youth in High-Level Spaces. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Andrea Cueva Medina. Andy is a professional, and I have known Andy for 4 years, so I know her as Andy. Andrea is a professional with a background in pedagogy, a master's in corporate social responsibility, and an EDM in education policy analysis from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Throughout her career, she has worked in training, research, consulting, organizational development, teaching, and team leadership. She has collaborated with UNESCO, the Dialogue, IPARE, Corrego Cedros, Mexico's Ministry of Education, Younga, Unite 2030, World Merit, and has consulted with international clients in human resources and educational technology. She is the co-author of the report, The Future of Higher Education, presented at the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference 2022 in Barcelona, and Upper Secondary School Dropouts in Mexico, Causes and Policy Solutions, from the book Learning Education Policy Analysis to Make the World Better. She presented at the Global Education Conference, Education, Climate Change, and Inequality 2024 at Harvard. She is a passionate advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals in education, empowerment, development, and gender equity. Thank you. And I will now turn it to you.
Thank you. Is it working? Is it working? Yes? Perfect. Thank you and welcome everyone. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for the organizers, and pretty excited to also represent Latin America, which I don't think that there are a lot of people of Latin America here. Let me introduce my panelists here. I'm very excited and honored to be with you. So let me start with Virgil Parker. He is a human rights advocate with Rory Munchine, Communications Associate for the Coalition of the UN We Need, and also Maria Udalova, Steering Committee Member of Students for Nuclear Disarmament, Director of Policy Development of the American Youth Association. So welcome everyone. And this will be like an informal conversation with these amazing youth leaders that they have participated in very high level spaces. They have been part of the UN Summit for the Future. And we want to listen to their perspectives, their insights, their experiences to demystify these high-level spaces to make sure that we inspire you to learn to advocate for yourself, create your own networks, and learn from each other. So based on that, let's start introducing yourselves. So 1 minute each, tell us who you are, the place that you call home, and the work that you're doing. So Michael, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me? All right, so my name is Michael Odianugu. I am a MPNA Master Candidate at NYU. I'm also a proud NAACP member. And what place that I call home? Well, kind of two places, if I can cheat a little bit. I would say, first of all, my country where I am from, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I also call New York City home, which was the country that welcomed me as I fled as a refugee. And what I do for work, first and foremost, I'm the global ambassador for SDG #1 for UN and USA. And on top of that, a lot of my advocacy work, even in relation to my studies at NYU, pertains to advocacy more so on the side of political action. So a lot of what I do is how can we build relationships between governments and NGOs to help people who are most marginalized, such as communities back home where I'm from in the Congo.
Thank you. Rory?
Thank you. I don't think this is working.
Thank you, bro.
Oh, we'll trade. Hi, everybody. My name is Rory Munshine. I'm from New York City, New York, and I'm Communications Associate with the Coalition for the UN We Need, which is a collection of civil society organizations that are working together to promote UN that is more fit for purpose and more people-centered. And what I love about this work is that it connects to my work from the past, where I've spent the past 10 years promoting people-centered policymaking in different sectors. And what I love about that is finding the relationships between different social issues like the SDGs and really thinking about how we can work together and build coalitions to make policies more accessible and inclusive. I am also a member of the UNA USA Global Goals Ambassadors Program. I am the representative for SDG 10. And so I'm focused on the intersectionalities between SDG 1 and all the other SDGs, and really thinking about ways in which we can build coalitions across different sectors, across different issue areas to really educate and empower people and make changes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Maria?
My name is Maria Delova, and I do work for Students for Nuclear Disarmament and the American Youth Association. I am a full-time student in high school, but apart from that, I try to introduce activism and advocacy work to high school and college level students to show them that we have the capability to make a change, make an impact, and I try to lead them and mentor them in, how to do it.
Thank you. So now we know about you and the work that you do. We would love to know how you got involved into youth activism. So Maria, would you like to start?
Sure. I was always really interested in getting involved in environmental activism, but in February of last year, so during my junior year, I was approached by the founder of Students for Nuclear Disarmament, and he wanted to encourage me to start a chapter of Students for Nuclear Disarmament at my high school. So that is when I started working with other nuclear disarmament activists, other climate activists, and started doing things like lobbying at the State House, taking other students to come with me.
Thank you. Rory?
So I got my career started in activism in general, not necessarily youth activism, but I do think that youth activism is a very important part of that conversation. Since I was very little, I have been involved in campaigns and different policy efforts to really empower people. And that passion comes from my personal experience as a person with a disability, where I felt like I was unseen, unheard, and I knew that my community was unseen and unheard. And I knew that activism was a way of really changing the conversation, and that it was a necessity to ensure that my rights were respected, irrespective of the jurisdiction that I happened to be in that moment. And I love that I've been able to apply these in different spaces, in different sectors like journalism, nonprofits, social impact, private sector, and even with the Coalition for the UME Need. And I love that I also had the opportunity to be the first openly disabled delegate at the G20 Youth Summit, where it really did underscore the importance of intersectional identities and really creating spaces that are accessible for different youth and allowing them to have those opportunities. So, yeah.
Thank you. Michael?
So for me, it was more so of a story rather. So around 2018, I began to look at a lot of like the activism work happening in the Congo, particularly in light of what the Eastern Congo faces, in particular Goma. And so I became heavily just attentive to there. So there is a youth movement called, at the time I see already some familiar community spaces here, called Lucha, right, which stands for, in the Congo in French, we'd be standing for Lutte pour le changement, meaning a fight for change movement. And I began to look into a lot of what they were doing. They were advocating for access to clean water. They were advocating for good quality of education, even in ways in which we can hold governments accountable and their duties to really help the people in light of the poverty that the people are facing there. And one of the leaders within the group, his name was Luc Kunula. It really started from him, where I began to really look at a lot of stuff that he was doing. He got to come here in DC, where he received the Amnesty Conscious Award for Courage. And a lot of the things that he was doing, this was really my way of like, oh, I'm actually inspired by what this guy was doing. Up until June 9th, he was at one of the events in Eastern Congo, speaking to the youth, engaging with them, getting them, involved in the political process. When he got home on that June 9th evening, up until midnight afterwards, what happened was that there was a fire that was set in his home. And ultimately, what happened was that the home was, it burned, exploded, and he passed away in that sense. But what's important for us to remember in that story is that before he passed away, he was arrested multiple times, right? Because he would be one of the strong voices in the Congo, demanding the government to step up, demanding the government to hold even exterior or external factors, other corporations accountable for what is done in the Eastern Congo. and a lot of the trials and torture that members of this group went through and leading up until to his death. And for me in that moment was like, I was here, I felt really powerless. I was in the USA, I was a teenager when it happened. I'm like, oh my God, this person that we're looking up to as an icon just passed away in this way, mysterious ways. And so I began to reach out to lawmakers here in the United States. In that way, that was kind of like my way of starting to get interested into the movement, into really what it means to be an advocate. When you see something that's wrong, you do something about it.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that we are all inspired here, and that's why we are here, trying to seek for a better future, to learn from each other and start not to feel powerless, but how to gather those resources for us, like to start networking and really creating the change that we're looking for. So regarding that, I wanted to discuss about your barriers, the barriers that you have faced as youth activists. Which are they, in which sectors, and what have you done to overcome them? So Rory, would you like to start?
Sure. So I think that there are a lot of different barriers that youth face, and I think that they are disproportionate based on identity. So I know that youth from different backgrounds face additional barriers. As a woman, I know that I faced barriers in terms of people not taking me seriously, calling me little girl. Love that for me. And I know that as a younger woman, people are like, oh, you should be more demure, be more cutesy, be more off to the side. And it's been a bit of a challenge to really figure out how to enter this space and be taken seriously as a professional so that people can see me as an equal adult and that I don't have to adhere to those gender roles. As a person with a disability, I sometimes feel like I have to be the model minority because people with disabilities are just so underrepresented in these spaces. It's ridiculous. And so as a result, I feel like I have to carry the burdens and the pains of the community that I represent and have to be a model minority because in some spaces, it feels like people with disabilities are not there, and therefore people are looking to my behavior to inform their perception of disability rights. And that's a bit of a challenge as well. And then also combining that with being a younger person, it's a bit challenging too, because people associate youth with naivety, and that's not necessarily the case. Young people look at things differently. They have optimism, but optimism is not a naive concept. It is important to know that having optimism is a good thing. It's this idea that we believe that the world can be a better place. And when we have that optimism that the world can be a better place, we're going to take action to actually make the world a better place. And it's about turning the pain that we face into power. And that's not a naive concept. So those are some of the barriers that I've seen. And I know that some of these spaces aren't accessible. I know that sometimes it's difficult to be able to afford to attend these conferences. Pre-COVID, these conferences were not, in fact, hybrid. They were in person, and you had to pay your way to get there. And when you have to pay your way to get there, it leads to an underrepresentation of communities that may or may not be able to afford this. It leads to an underrepresentation of diverse voices. And I think that that's also a barrier, that these conversations have been dominated by those that can afford to engage in them. But I'm also seeing those barriers be lifted in a hybrid environment. Now, those hybrid environments are not perfect. Sometimes those hybrid environments don't allow for participants online to have the same experience, but I can say that it is looking better in that regard, at the fact that they actually exist. So.
Thank you for that. It was. And if you could learn one concept also that it is very important when you are creating solutions and policy is intersectionality, and knowing that everything, well, look for it. If you have any questions, we can discuss it later, because right now we want to listen to them. So Michael, can you tell us about the barriers that you have faced as a youth advocate?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. A similar experience to Rory, actually. So I also identify as a person with a disability. And I think for me, it was a double barrier. First, as a person of color, and also having a disability, in the sense that a lot of these room and spaces, just to give you just a little background. So when I first was diagnosed, right, with one of the first challenges that I started facing was the ability to walk, for instance. Then I had to learn how to walk again, to physical therapy. Up until now, the glory of God, I'm able to. But afterwards, there was a moment when I remember I just didn't want to stay home, go to school to NYU, come back, and then that's it. That's just life, right? So I wanted to be more engaged. So I began to apply to a lot of these spaces, even just to volunteer alone. And what I realized as I was sharing with Rory earlier on is that whenever I would apply, almost immediately my application was rejected or denied as soon as I checked the box that I am a person with a disability. Right? So it began from that moment on. And I'm like, okay, but I know that I do qualify. I am at NYU, I got in there through a scholarship, and I have all these various, qualifications, but why is it that's not happening for me? So I became curious, and then I started to reapply months later to the exact same positions again, even just volunteering, this time without clicking that box, and my applications were processed a lot more further. And so for me, that was when I realized that in a lot of these spaces, there are many marginalized communities and peoples who are not given a voice or even just a platform to engage in these kind of like settings where we are right now. And that was really a struggle for me to go through and to understand that, okay, this is definitely the problem. I did not anticipate to have another double barrier. Already as a person of color, it's hard enough to have opportunity within the United States and also in the world, but to have an additional barrier with a disability. And so for me, that was just kind of like the surprising kind of like situation that I kind of find myself in. But I do speak about it to just emphasize an importance to speak for every voice, even those that we often don't get to see.
Thank you.
Can I
Thank you
just
so
say
much.
something?
Yes, of course.
But I think that like, thank you so much for that story. And that also highlights the tokenism also as part of it too, because you often hear that people are like, oh, I want to have a youth voice. That's great. Well, what are you going to do with this youth voice? Is it just to check a box, or is it because you actually want to have meaningful engagement? And so sometimes as somebody with a disability, I find that people call me the unicorn. I've actually been called a unicorn to my face. And I'm like, what does that mean? Apparently it means that we are underrepresented, which is not a surprise, but they're like, oh, you're a person with a disability. Great. Can you be on this panel and talk about disability rights? Well, I would love to do that, but also what are you going to do with this experience that I'm sharing? Is it just because you want this story to be told without any avenues for meaningful follow-up or engagement? And I think that that's the other challenge that young people are facing too, is that they're looking for opportunities to, advance their careers. They're looking for opportunities to share their stories, but they're facing audiences that are seeing them as just a token, as just a checkbox, and not necessarily seeing them as meaningful stakeholders and equal stakeholders too. And that's especially true for people from underrepresented communities.
Exactly. It is so hard to actually be represented, but at the same time have fun. Ready? It is so hard to be represented in these spaces, but to have to be impactful, to really be heard and being taken into account when there are decisions that are being taken. What are the challenges that you have faced?
I think a lot of the initiatives that I have tried to pass in my town, I'll say this specifically in my field of, I guess, nuclear disarmament, a lot of people have resigned to themselves to the idea that our current situation will never change. And it's such a huge problem that, we, especially young people, won't be able to do anything about it. But which is not true. But specifically, whenever I have tried to, pass a specific initiative in my town or something, I've been told, oh, this process is too hard, it'll take too long, and you won't be able to do it, not expecting me to push back or anything. And I know that this is in part because I'm a woman, but also because I'm 17 and I don't have as much experience, or I guess maybe a degree, that other activists or advocates might have. So it's definitely a barrier that I face, that people just do not believe in the power of like an individual to have the will to see something to completion and to not just give up immediately when they face their first roadblock.
No, what you said was really important about the power of individuals. So we've heard about the barriers that you have faced, but we want to give everyone hope about what is happening and what can we do to actually change the situation. So what are the things that you've seen that are working to have intergenerational leadership? So Michael, would you like to start?
So one of the things, that I got to see that's working, definitely platforms like this, right, where you are literally, in a sense, giving a voice to young folks from various cultures. I can see even this audience right here, many of us come from various backgrounds. And that alone is a first major step to just give a way where, or to open a door rather to, a whole set of people who also want to be heard. 16% of the world, and this is according to UN records and database, are between the ages of 14 to 24. And that already shows you this is a large number when you think of it in that sense, meaning that, in other words, this is a whole group of people who also are facing different sort of circumstances. Some are in different parts of the world where human rights is not a guarantee to be able to be here, to stand here, for example, as myself, to speak on behalf of the many who are back home. And that alone is a blessing in itself, right? And that's one of the things showing that it's definitely working. We are going towards a goal, which is to open more doors for people who are of different backgrounds, not just those who can afford services or can afford meetings like this. And so that's definitely one thing that we're kind of advocating for more of. It's happening, but let's continue to open doors for other people.
And a practical advice to open doors?
I would say if you are a youth, two things I would say. Number one thing I would say, continue learning about the world around you. Continue to learn about everything that's happening. Continue to learn about the policies that we're talking about discussing. When I was young, someone used to tell me, if you don't take care of politics, politics will take care of you. And that's a way to say that get involved and get engaged. Learn about what's happening right now. And I know right now the trends that we're talking about, reproductive rights, voting rights, and various other things. Educate yourself about what is happening. And then number two, do something about it too. One of my favorite quotes, which is from Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, which says that if you're not given a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair. In that sense, right? Demand for those, conversations to start taking place. And I think even, for instance, reflecting back to the leadership summit that we went to in DC, it makes a difference when you're there, when you're engaging with these leaders and lawmakers, where you know what you're talking about, that you actually are educated about those topics, and they look at you in a different kind of light, that this is not just some youth coming here inside the office, but he or she is clearly educated about this thing. They're passionate about it, and you can see that they did some research about it, and they're here really advocating for themselves. So educate yourself, learn about what's happening around the world, and do something by being engaged.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Roy, what has worked?
Thank you so much. I know that like oftentimes young people hear that, everything is horrible, awful, like we're on the verge of a nuclear war. Our planet is,
Dying.
rapidly decelerating, and, we're all going to die. And I know that that can be very overwhelming and that can be very terrifying. But I personally take joy in the fact that I can be active and that I can engage in these spaces and work towards the world that I actually want to see, as opposed to the world that everybody's telling me is going to happen. Because I don't think that deceleration is inevitable. I think it takes political will, and I think it takes strategic coalition building in order to change the status quo. And I think that it's about strategic advocacy. Now, I do have a lot of optimism about the road forward. And I think that that's because we're starting to see changes at the UN level that are creating more spaces for meaningful youth engagement. So for example, the UN 75 consultations that happened in 2020 provided an opportunity for the UN to be more people-centered and promote this idea of we the peoples, which are the first three words in the UN Charter. And I think that that was the first time that the UN really thought about its relationship to the public and really finding ways to ensure that people feel empowered in the UN space and create a UN that's more fit for purpose. You take that to our common agenda, which was in 2021, which also talked about youth engagement. You take that even to the most recent Pact for the Future, where they actually recognized the ECOSOC Youth Summit as an avenue and a legitimate forum for youth engagement. You take that as well to the passage of the UN Youth Office as well that recently happened. So you're seeing that there are more formal spaces for youth engagement, and I think that's a byproduct of this advocacy, this refusal to accept no as an answer, this youth movement to really empower and center youth voices and opinions into the global conversation. And I do think that the pandemic has brought a lot of different avenues for engagement. We're seeing that there's a lot of online mobilization where youth can come together from all over the world and share experiences, share stories, and really think about ways in which they can facilitate partnerships, make sure that their impact is not only localized, but also regionalized, that's also globalized. And the fact that there is this online space for youth advocacy has really accelerated the movement as well. The fact that there are hybrid opportunities for participation has allowed for young people to engage in spaces that they may or may not have been able to afford to engage in the first place. I think that also with the hybrid environment, it's creating spaces for accessibility, and it's allowing for people with disabilities to engage, whereas previously they may not have been able to because they may have been homebound, they may not have been able to travel. And I also think that there's a hope as well because the UN has recently had sign language in their meetings, which I've been involved with the UN for years, I have never seen before. And I take that as a victory. We're seeing a UN accessibility office, which I just visited recently. It was very awesome, where you can learn about different accommodations that the UN provides. And I think that that's a byproduct of this advocacy. And it's a byproduct of this movement, this understanding that there needs to be changes made and that there are new technologies that we can leverage to make these changes and create equal environments.
Thank you.
Hope that's not too much info.
No, it's great. Actually, it gives us a lot of ideas of things that are working and changing because of youth activism. So let's keep going and doing. And what have you seen, Maria, that has worked?
I think that what Rory brought up with sort of changing your mindset and thinking, okay, maybe the world, it's going on not a great path, but instead of just sitting back and, watching that happen, we don't have to accept that future. We don't just have to accept the fact that we only have a few years until it's not, climate change isn't reversible and things like that. So I think that adopting the mindset of, okay, it's bad, but I can do something about it and I will do something about it. I have the resources, I have the support. I think also finding confidence in your voice, because everyone has to start somewhere, and no one is just born like a naturally amazing speaker or born knowing like every single person that's in the UN. So finding the confidence to put yourself in situations that might be uncomfortable, but eventually will give you more experience in like activism spaces, things like that. And I also think that what you brought up with coming with the background and like the education and the knowledge, because it's really key to understand that when you put yourself in a space as a youth, older individuals or individuals that aren't youth activists are seeing you, and you are therefore representing the whole youth movement. So you have to make sure that the image that you put out is one of an educated youth. You have to show that we know what we're talking about. We are capable of having this knowledge and these ideas to bring to the table.
Exactly. If you are sitting in that table, you have to acknowledge the privilege that you're having, because you are, in a way, taking the place of someone that could be there, that could be more educated than you are. So,
but also, I was going to say that youth are not a monolith either. Like, there's no such thing as one youth voice. Like, young people face different challenges all over the world. There's no like sameness in that. There's a common bond in that they are all youth, but youth experience the world differently. And I think that one thing that's important to keep emphasizing is that there is no one youth. You're not representing all youth. You're representing a youth voice, but you're representing a particular youth voice. And that it's important to engage youth from all over the world to understand the extent to which youth experiences vary and the ways in which multilateral systems like the UN can really bring people together and talk about this inequality of experience and what actions can be taken to create an equality of experience where human rights are universally respected, irrespective of the jurisdiction you happen to be in. So I completely understand what you're saying about how like it's a lot of pressure for young people, and it's not fair that the young people have this pressure, that they have to come across as constantly ready all of the time. And that's an unfair burden, and that is a challenge. But it is important to recognize that even though you are facing that pressure, that nobody is perfect. Nobody is the one and sole representative. So even if you may make mistakes along the way, it's important to still be engaged and still represent youth voices and represent your voice as well, and empower other people through that and create space for other people. My favorite motto is step up and also step back. Step up for yourself, step up for your community, but also step back and be willing to learn from other people as well. And that includes previous generations too.
thank you.
I totally agree with you.
No, and there is really no real inclusion if we actually don't have marginalized groups, or if we want to portray the experience from everyone for just one individual. Of course, there is no real representation there. So how would you imagine the world where there would be intergenerational leadership across different sectors? What would be the difference? How would it would look like? Where have you seen it, maybe?
You want to go?
Yeah, sure. one of the things that I did with the school that I used to work with was I was given the responsibility to come up with a curriculum that ties into advocacy and activism. So we developed the curriculum for fifth graders, the time that was the highest grade in the school. And then when the kids were learning about, the government and how by being involved in this process, how to really advocate for voting rights. This was a school in a Black and brown neighborhood, so issues pertaining to the population. And what they did was, at the end of everything that we learned towards, like, it was around like February, and then now we were like, okay, but what are we gonna do in June for the big and main kind of like project? So the kids wanted to go to DC, right? We were like, okay, we want to go to a place where we see where lawmaking actually happens. And so we were like, okay, so us with the teachers, we got together, we said, I think it's a way for them, in order to give them a voice, let them figure out how exactly we're gonna get there. So in each classroom, we did this classroom presidents sort of thing where the winners, or like the presidents, the president-elect, and then the vice president of the classroom would then come together and sit down the kids, decide on how we would fundraise for this big project to go to DC to bring the whole grade in there. So the kids got together, they elected the presidents, the vice presidents, and whatnot, and then they brainstormed ideas, we supported them. And then when fundraising began, after 1 month and a half, we raised over $10,000 in the school. And this was the kids raising it, their own ideas, us guiding them. And then we're like, okay, we need to do movie nights. We need to go to the community, sell popcorn, do this many different things. And they were able to raise more than $10,000 to bring the whole entire grade to DC. And for me, to tie back up to your question, I see a world where changes would happen a bit more faster if we were to engage really everyone, even the little ones, like the very little ones, the kids, and we were able to engage them in these conversations, begin to teach them about the SDGs, or expose them to it, expose them to how they can be advocates for themselves, for their communities, for other people, and how we can help other people. What are projects that we can do to support one another? And if we were able to do that across the globe, where we're giving a voice to young people with different experiences, different backgrounds, giving them the ability to really become advocates. And I definitely see the world changing towards a more positive step. And let's just continue to do this work, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Let's try to replicate that in different places. What has worked, Maria?
I think
Sorry. Well, how the world that you envision?
Totally fine. I also do envision a world where change happens faster. Obviously, young voices are listened to much more often. And I'm fortunate enough to attend a school where students do have a lot of power. So for example, we have a student government, a lot of student council activity, and we're taught from a very early age that we can engage with adults and they will not only listen to us, but also implement the policies that we see fit for our school. And so at this institution, advocacy for our own, rights kind of starts very, very early. And I think that in the future, I would like to see that much more, kind of showing students that not only are you capable, but kind of guiding them in ways that they can do that. So they learn from a very early age and can then pass on that information and sort of apply it to their later lives. So I would like to see a world where sort of guiding youth into advocacy happens faster and also in like a very structured manner, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Rory, you are the most hopeful of all of us.
Oh, am I?
What is the world that you envision?
Oh, well, I want to live in a world where people's dignity is respected, irrespective of what jurisdiction they've been in. And I keep saying that, but I think that's true because my rights as a woman are contingent upon where I happen to be in that moment. In the United States, there are 31 states, I believe, that allow the forcible sterilization of girls with disabilities, which is so disheartening. In the United States, they allow for people with disabilities to be paid half of the minimum wage, which subjects them to poverty and also leads to social stigmatization and also leads to greater spending on social services. Because even though people with disabilities represent 10% of the Medicaid population, they represent 50% of the costs. And I think that that's absolutely ridiculous where, it depends on what state I happen to be in, where to determine what my rights are. I think it's ridiculous that it depends on what country it is to determine what my rights are. And I want a world where rights are universally respected. And I think that the way in which we can do that is to really promote cross-sectoral partnerships and issue partnerships. I think that one of the challenges when it comes down to the SDGs is that we all have the thing that we're passionate about. Like some people are super, super passionate about the climate, and that's understandable because, you know, maybe they've experienced the effects of climate change. We have people that are super passionate about gender justice, which is understandable because that could be based on your lived experience and your personal passions. But I think it's about thinking outside of your own issue areas and thinking about how you can market that to people in other issue areas in order to build coalitions. So it's worth noting that climate change disproportionately affects women. It disproportionately affects people with disabilities, where people with disabilities are twice as likely to live in poverty and more likely to live in flood zones. And I think that if you focus on that intersectionality and that interrelationship between issues, you're more likely to get partnerships and more likely to get people to sign on to your cause. And that's how you get to the top of the news cycle. That's how you get to the top of people's minds. And that's how you get your issues to become prioritized. And I don't necessarily see as much of that cross-issue collaboration as I think would be good and what I think is necessary. And what I want to encourage people and different leaders to do is to think outside of their own issue areas. And I think that this idea that if I focus outside of my issue area, then my issue won't be prioritized is a misconception. I think that there is a lot of strength to that cross partnership.
Thank you. There's a lot of work ahead of us, so let's start them young, as they were saying. So we also want to be practical. Which tools and resources do you use for your work, and which one would you recommend them? What are the resources that will help them in this activism journey?
Oh, do you want to go?
Right?
The optimist here. So my favorite quote is by Audre Lorde, and it's this. It's that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. And what that means is that people that benefit from inequality are less likely to give up their privilege in order to advocate for what is moral or what is just because you tell them to. So something that I do is I like to focus on the economics and externalities of exclusion and show that it costs more money to disenfranchise people than it does to promote their inherent dignity. And sometimes I get pushed back from human rights advocates where they'll say, well, you can't necessarily quantify a human life, which is true, but also you need to think about the economics of how you're going to implement it in order to be practical. And I think that you need to frame human rights as both a moral and financial imperative. So that's the tool that I use to appeal to different stakeholders, because stakeholders are all motivated by different things. And at the end of the day, morality is great, but morality is subjective. And you need to think about how are you going to convince people who profit off of inequality? How do you convince people that it's in their financial interest, that it's in their legal interest to work for your causes? And I think that that is a tool that I've used in my own advocacy. When it comes down to social media, I really love it because it gives you an opportunity to connect with people that are focusing on the same things as you. So I love to use Twitter. I actually do the live tweeting for C4UN, and I look at the hashtags that people are using. So for example, recently I saw Our Common Future, which was the hashtag for Summit of the Future. I saw the hashtag Pact for the Future, and I saw what people were saying. And I was able to really find Twitter accounts that were talking about these things, seeing people's different perspectives, and then connecting them to our movement. And I think that that's a tool that people don't necessarily use as much as they could, but finding those hashtags and finding the people that are engaging in that conversation and then just reaching out to them. And that could be done on Twitter, which I personally think is the strongest one that I have, because that's where people are providing live updates. But you can also do that on LinkedIn as well. You can find people that are working in the same sector as you, or people that share the same interests as you, and be open to having that conversation. So using social media to your advantage is a great strategy. And then also applying things in different sectors. I think that that's one of the tools that I use. I've worked in journalism, so I've written about these things. I've worked in social impact. I've worked in the private sector, and really thinking about how you can work in different sectors in order to promote that cross-sectoral collaboration. I think that that's a very strong tool to have, and that's also what makes you a more talented and more valuable advocate, and that's what gives you access to these spaces.
Thank you. Maria, what resources do you use?
I think I have kind of a unique position because most of the time I'm trying to mobilize like high school students to go out and advocate. And it can be very difficult to get a high schooler to miss school when it's like the end of the year and they've run out of absences. It's really, really hard. So I think I don't know how much of a tool it is, but it definitely is a method. Trying to find what motivates people to do things can be a way to get them to do kind of what you want. So I know that personally, this might be a little bit controversial, maybe not very ethical, so I'm sorry. But whenever I'm trying to get a large group of students to come lobby with me, for example, I tell them, hey, this is going to look so good on your college resume and things like that. And it gets them interested and it gets them active. And then it gets people to do things that they might have not done. And then they realize their interest in a subject, because I've taken so many students to go out and do advocacy and things like that with me. And then they come back and I ask them, oh, hey, how was it? They were like, oh, it was amazing. And they wouldn't have done that if I was just like, hey, come lobby with me. So I think that finding people's motivations and then sort of not using them, but utilizing them when you're trying to convince them to join you in your effort is really important. And I will say as well, of course, social media and online tools are incredibly useful in sharing information about events or different issues. And personally, there's a website called Action Network that I really like, where it's like you can send basically just like sort of not like the same information, but if you're trying to get a governor, for example, to pay attention to something, you could draft an email, send it to them. It's really awesome. I'd recommend checking it out.
I laugh because I think we've all done that. We've all used people's motivations to get action going.
And you are actually not lying, telling them that it will be good on your
Yeah,
your
exactly.
It's
Exactly.
ethical. It's totally
Yeah,
ethical.
there's no lie. It does look really good on your college resume.
Right, and exactly to add on to that too, like I know, like for example, when you're trying to apply to university, like the main ones, right? Yes, they look at your grades, but a lot of times they also look at what have you done besides just academics. What are the works that? How do we see you engaging in your community? So that's actually a very great thing, and to even pitch it that way, that you're actually setting them up for the future.
Yeah, because thank you. I do think that like it opens people up to such a new world, because otherwise they just would not have like thought to go put themselves in that situation. So when you come to them and you're like, you could do this, it'll benefit you this way. And then the sort of secret hidden thing is that they might really like it and keep doing it.
And also you're setting them up for the future, because if they advocate for the climate, then they'll have they will actually have a future, you know?
It works every way. Michael, any resource or tool that you would like to talk about?
Oh yeah, so I typically look at the Human Rights Watch database. That really allows me to keep myself informed about the various parts of the world where we see human rights are, on the line, in jeopardy. And, the fact alone that we can even gather in spaces like this and speak about our own future or the rights of the youth or voices of people that oftentimes we don't get to hear. In many places of the world, it's not a privilege. People don't have the blessing or the privilege to be gathered, to travel, to be in spaces like this. And so that tool, definitely the Human Rights Watch database, allows me to keep myself informed. And similarly to a point that Rory had mentioned before, it allows me to learn also about other parts of the world besides the ones that I'm kind of like more focused on, obviously the Congo, as it is a pressing issue, but it allows me to also learn about what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in South Sudan, what's happening in Chad, what's happening in Sierra Leone, and in different parts of the world, and so forth, to keep myself open-minded. Just a little shout out to the UNA USA. I also do, in the passport, and which is like kind of like an article or I guess form, if you may say it that way, which keeps us informed about United Nations, the policies, the current trends, and whatnot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, there's RSS newsfeeds too.
Sorry.
I was also going to say you can also use RSS newsfeeds too to aggregate information, because sometimes it can be very difficult to follow everything at once.
Yeah.
And the point that you mentioned, that there's this erroneous and really frustrating expectation that all young people have to know everything all at once in order to be considered legitimate stakeholders. So one other tool that I was going to recommend to you is an RSS newsfeed that summarizes everything. So that way you can sort of get a snapshot of all these different things. So if it comes up in a conversation, that's great. But also you can focus on your own issue areas without taking too much time. And also podcasts and like summaries of what's going on in the news is very good as well. So then you can understand intersectionality, be informed, but also focus on your own area without having to feel like, oh my God, I need to know everything at once.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have time for questions. We can have some questions online or questions from the audience. I see someone over there.
I guess we'll share.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also listening.
Well, this is Bilal Jamshid from Swatini, Pakistan. And, I belong to a place where Twitter trend doesn't work. Twitter is not allowed over there. And let me not be specific to my area. There, I know a lot of places where you do not have access to electricity, and you do not have access to internet permanent, and you have limited social media use. Then how can you get access to high level spaces? Secondly, if you rely on the government, so most of the countries participants would believe that if they have strong ties with the sitting government, like they have politically the same approach as the sitting government have, then in their case they are only allowed to sit and come to the United Nations and represent over there. Otherwise, you won't get any chance. So my question is, how can those youth get once in a time access to any high level? Thank you.
Oh, can I? I love that question. I agree with you that, social media access varies based on where you are. I know that in China, for example, they have their own version of Twitter called Weibo. And I know that there are other alternatives in different countries, but I agree that that can be a challenge, especially when you think about the digital divide. So one thing that I do want to emphasize is that the most recent Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact calls for ameliorating the digital divide. So I am actually optimistic at the fact that the multilateral governments are going to take action to ameliorate the digital divide. But I acknowledge that is a challenge at present. What I will say is that there are opportunities for those young people, obviously not as many as there should be, but there are opportunities for those young people to engage in regional organizations as well. They have different associations in different countries. And I understand that civil society voices are often repressed in those countries. I know that because I used to work with Civicus and their membership advisory group, where we provided grants to people in civil society countries where civil society voices were repressed. But I agree that that is a challenge. But I also know that there are opportunities for young people to get involved with regional organizations, with different national efforts and different coalitions that are country specific, and engage and scale their advocacy upwards.
And I would like to add that, there was a time before internet existed. I would really recommend the book, or even reading about Marshall Gans, a professor from Harvard University that is creating, he has talked about organizing, and he explains methodology and how you can actually achieve people like getting together and lead change. Any other question? Thank you for the question. Yes? It's the guy.
Good afternoon. My name is President of California, originally from Canada. I work in corporate America. I have a question, but I think the gentleman's second part of this question was not answered, which I think is a very important part. That's about the political will. I don't know if you guys get it, but it's a very, because in my terms of answer that question. If you guys can help us, what is my food process? What I can see do to help moderate that constraint that member state of the use of this for like this. Because without political will, or if everything that people decides for use was to be heard, always the largest part of the society will be left behind. So this is a big problem, and that's the big UN is the main national party. If you fight if they are not fully represented, if there is a complete disconnect between the global leaders and global leaders, we keep on rhetoric approaches that are not practical. So, is there any mechanism or will there be any where either depression or the lack of involvement of perceived other elements in the society that are not in the government. I would think that it's very fundamental. My own part of depression is a global problem. The previous speaker had mentioned the everyday wars, starvations that are living in the world everywhere. But all we understand from the global leaders is more of talking than action. What will be the goal of the youth to preserve the next generation of leaders and nations free from global catastrophes, climate change, green energy, but most important, to live in harmony that is a relentless war that killing of women and children, mostly innocent.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to answer it as much because it was a pretty loaded question, but I will attempt to just using my own example. But quickly on the International Youth Conference, I know that we were also providing some sort of like documents helping in terms of visa applications for people who were from different parts of the world who had wanted to attend. And also, and it is a continuation in terms of this conversation about how can, now moving on to the UN, how can the UN help in terms of allowing or to facilitate people from different parts of the country. I know for a fact that for us, people who are of African descent, coming into these different environments, it's pretty hard to get a visa, and that's just the truth. And it is a reality, and it is continuously a conversation that we're having. I think the way that I saw your question, to add on to also the gentleman's question right here too, do not wait for anyone in order for you to start doing something. I don't know if that kind of like makes sense. So in the United Nations, what I always keep in mind is the fact that, first of all, the structure of the UN, where you have over 190 countries working together, it's never going to be perfect. And that's just the first thing from the beginning. And second of all, understanding the structure of the UN, when it comes to, for example, the 5 permanent countries, that already blocks a lot of changes to happen. There are various initiatives that the UN had proposed coming from the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, but then it cannot happen as long as one country says no. If Russia says no, if the US says no, it's not going to happen, right? In that sense, so understanding that, what I oftentimes do is I resort to, okay, what can we, the people, actually do? How can we unite and really collaborate with us, just even if it just begins, right here with us, the youth right here? How can we unite and demand a lot of these changes? And as one force, if I may say. So for example, when I mentioned earlier, one of the mentors in the Congo, the Lucha, who passed away, when he had passed away, what happened was that around that time, the Congolese government had shut down communication for about like a week, right? Because first of all, to prevent the news from getting out. And second of all, this was a way to continue certain oppressions, continue arresting people of the movement who are majority of the youth. And our family members, I remember my own family members, not hearing from them, knowing that people were being killed for that 1 week gap when Luke had passed away. What we decided to do here, for those who were outside, we were like, okay, how can we unite the Congolese people in New York and those who are in Texas, those who are in DC? How can we begin to call our lawmakers, us, even if it just begins with us? So we began to go to embassies. We went to the UN, sorry. We went to various embassies in Washington, DC. And those of us who were in Europe, in Brussels, we were going out there advocating at the European Union, advocating in embassies throughout the world, and trying to get something done, and for them to realize that this is a pressing issue. People are dying and no one is talking about this on the news. You're not hearing about it. So what happened as a result of that a few weeks after was that the United Nations finally decided to send investigators in the Eastern Congo to investigate what was happening, in particular to Luke's case and his death right there. So again, just to reiterate what I'm trying to say is that it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. And trust me, and I know that too, coming from the Congo, knowing that my country, the United States government, various American companies benefit from the suffering of the people in my country. And I know that. And it is very difficult. But I try to think about what part can I play. I'm not just going to wait on the UN to move and somehow miraculously. How can we unite and get more people involved? Keep spreading the word so that we as a people can actually champion and be a voice loud enough to bring about these changes.
Thank you. Thank you. So unfortunately, the time for the panel has finished. If you want to address the speakers later, you can. We just want to finish the panel saying thank you for being here, to opening to others and telling them about your experience. Thank you for the organizers. And remember that there is a lot of power in your voice. So thank you.